Good evening, everyone. I'm Rabbi Jesse Olitzky, one of the rabbis here at Congregation Bethel. We come together this evening to honor and celebrate the memory and the legacy of our beloved Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Jehiel Orenstein of blessed memory. I think especially at this moment in time, for these past few weeks, when there's been so many in our country who are praying with their feet, so many in our country who are participating in actions and protests. And I think about the role that justice plays in our Bethel community. That was something when I was interviewing to become rabbi here at Bethel just over 6 years ago. That was clear that this was a pillar of our institution. And everybody I talked to told me that it was Rabbi Orenstein who made sure that justice and action was just as much a part of who we were at Bethel as prayer and learning. And so as I look at what's going on in this country, I think about the words of Torah that Rabbi Orenstein would be teaching us in this moment. Well, we have a wonderful teacher, our colleague Rabbi Ed Feinstein, to learn with this evening to honor Rabbi Orenstein's memory. I want to first introduce another colleague and friend and really member of our Bethel community, who's been a member of our Bethel community a lot longer than I have, who grew up here and who taught Torah here and continues to teach us Torah every day, Rabbi Debra Orenstein.
Thank you for the gracious welcome and for those words about justice. We are here tonight for some chutzpah. Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav called it azut de kedusha, holy boldness. It requires courage to fight our weaker and baser natures. It requires daring to grow spiritually, to give up the comfort of good enough for the demands of not just good enough, but holy excellence. Rabbi Shlomo Carlebach talked about holy chutzpah. To pursue the path of holiness, of righteousness, of truly loving your neighbor, you can't be a wallflower. You have to speak up and sometimes to take radical action. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel coined the term spiritual audacity. 13 months before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, just one day before many faith leaders gathered at the White House, he sent a telegram to President John F. Kennedy, and it read like this: I look forward to privilege of being present at meeting tomorrow. Likelihood exists that Negro problem will be like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. Please demand of religious leaders personal involvement and not just solemn declaration. We forfeit the right to worship God as long as we continue to humiliate Negroes. Church, synagogue have failed. They must repent. Ask of religious leaders to call for national repentance and personal sacrifice. Let religious leaders donate 1 month's salary toward fund for Negro housing and education. I propose that you, Mr. President, declare state of moral emergency. A Marshall Plan for aid to Negroes is becoming a necessity. The hour calls for moral grandeur and spiritual audacity. In other words, for greatness and chutzpah. Heschel's words resonate very powerfully and painfully now in light of the murder of George Floyd and our renewed awareness of entrenched systemic racism. Now and then, holy chutzpah, azut de kedusha, spiritual audacity are important. Maybe today they're more important than ever. My father, in whose memory and merit we have gathered, had chutzpah, as those of you who knew him know. He was never shy to talk to a stranger under any circumstances. He was never afraid to ask questions. If the shy person finds it hard to learn, as the Mishnah suggests, that explains why my father was such an amazing lifelong student. My dad had truly holy chutzpah. And I'll give just 3 examples. In 1977, he partnered with Rose Thiering and Max Randall to create an interfaith commemoration of the Holocaust that happened in South Orange that year and has taken place every year since. It was something tremendously bold at that time to ask of both Jews and Christians. In 1977, Jews had a sense not just of personal tragedy, but even of ownership of the Holocaust. Many Christians felt trepidation and even revulsion at the thought of participating in a ceremony to memorialize the Holocaust. But Jehiel and Rose prevailed, and who could doubt, given their combined chutzpah, that they would? My parents spent decades visiting the Soviet Union, encouraging Jews behind the Iron Curtain, and their activism showed a holy chutzpah. In 1959, they met with Leah Luria, the first person to ever request an exit visa from the Soviet Union to go to Israel. It took chutzpah for her to meet with them, and vice versa. Both my parents were followed by the KGB on their several visits to Russia, though I believe it was only my mother who was detained. But you don't mess with Sylvia Orenstein. 1972 in Russia, my father taught in an underground ulpan at a time when people were just beginning to study Hebrew. Those students risked their lives and certainly their livelihoods. And my father was their partner and their teacher, not just in Hebrew, but in holy chutzpah. In 1980, the Seidens and the Leibowitzes and others from within and without Beth El joined my parents in a visit to Russia. They had many adventures, they did lasting good, and they exemplified the best of holy daring for a good cause. Around the year 2000, my father's holy chutzpah hit closer to home. He and my mother volunteered to house a political prisoner from Cameroon who was seeking asylum in this country. And my dad, uninvited, attended every hearing. He inserted himself by sheer chutzpah into the cause of justice, and he single-handedly tracked down a witness who could testify that this young applicant for asylum, Christophe Dossat, had never lied about his passport status. My father didn't do that because Christophe was his adoptive son. Christophe became his adoptive son, my brother, because of my father's holy chutzpah. We are blessed with the theme of chutzpah tonight because Rabbi Ed Feinstein has wonderful chutzpah. Eddie Feinstein didn't just write a book about it. It's not just his topic for tonight. He exhibits holy chutzpah all the time as a colleague and a friend. And I'll give you just 2 examples. When I lived in Los Angeles and I had a part-time pulpit, for a while was full-time at the University of Judaism, I often had my Shabbatot free. And when I did, I would love to go to Valley Beth Shalom to listen to Harold Schulweis and Ed Feinstein. And it never failed that when I was there on a Friday night or a Shabbat morning, no matter how big the crowd, at some point, Ed would sidle up to me and say conspiratorially, "Deb, do you want to give the drash?" He said it with great good humor, but I had no doubt in the way he offered that he was serious. My husband Craig was very shocked the first time he heard this, but also delighted by the chutzpah. And I was delighted by the genuine humility and modesty behind Ed's offer. He would clearly have been happy to step aside if I had ever taken him up on the offer to see the Bima to me. Secondly, I would say Ed Feinstein has tremendous chutzpah as a teacher. He is not afraid to raise difficult subjects. He is not afraid to correct people. He is hugely beloved, but he's willing to risk people being angry at him to tell them the truth. A couple of years ago, I was honored to be asked to teach homiletics at the Academy for Jewish Religion. And my first call was to Ed Feinstein, who has taught homiletics at American Jewish University for decades. And he told me about his students. I'm hard on them. I make them revise and revise and revise some more. I don't just tell them how wonderful they are. I'm tough. In keeping with that kind of holy chutzpah and dedication, Rabbi Ed Feinstein writes at the beginning of his book on chutzpah, we don't ask enough of our Judaism. A Judaism of warm ethnic sentimentality demands very little of us, and in return offers little spiritual wisdom. Ed has had the chutzpah to redefine chutzpah and to call us to it. Chutzpah is for him a celebration of human freedom, human possibility, human responsibility. It's a way of seeing Judaism as a heroic life. It's a way of connecting to eternal values and significance. The reward of walking in chutzpah is to know that you matter, that your life matters, that your dreams matter. In this, I quote from our teacher for tonight, Ed Feinstein. He's a friend, a colleague, the author of 5 books, the longtime leader of Valley Beth Shalom, and he has been a favorite teacher, not just of mine, but of Rabbi Rachel Marder and Rabbi Jehiel Orenstein. Ed Feinstein.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm very, very moved by your words, and it's a tremendous delight to be here with all of you this evening and to share a few moments of learning in memory of our teacher, Rabbi Orenstein. I have a very close connection to you. You don't know me very well. Right now, I'm sitting in my living room in a coat and tie, which feels a little odd. But I was born in Newark, New Jersey, where my mother's family is from, and spent the first 6 years of my life in Irvington, New Jersey. And had it not been for a quirk of fate, would have ended up as your congregant, Rabbi Olitzky, rather than your colleague. We decided to move to California when I was 6 to follow my father's dreams of being near his parents, and that's why I grew up in Southern California. It is a particular honor to be here to teach some Torah in honor of Rabbi Orenstein. I grew up with Rabbi Orenstein as one of the great heroes of this generation of rabbis. And it is a real distinct privilege for a few moments to stand in his place and to teach in his place. He wrote a wonderful tribute to his teacher, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I'd like to quote to you just one line of that beautiful tribute, because I think it captures himself, and I think it captures the memory that all of you cherish of him. He wrote of Heschel, and I quote, that Heschel wrote, "A religious man is a person who holds God and man in one thought at one time, at all times, who suffers from harm done to others, whose greatest passion is compassion, whose greatest strength is love and defiance of despair." And then he concludes his tribute to his teacher, Rabbi Heschel, by saying, "I was privileged to know this great man. All who learned from him will never forget his teaching." And so it is with Rabbi Orenstein as well. And it is my privilege to be with you this evening to share a few words of Torah in his memory. Again, I suppose we should apologize for the strangeness of this venue. I have a wonderfully funded air ticket to New Jersey, and I was looking forward to spending some time with my dear friends, Rabbi Olitzky and Rabbi Marder, and to meet the Orenstein family and to meet all of you. But instead, welcome to my living room. And I'm glad I can jump into your living rooms and we can have a chance to spend a little time learning together. I grew up in Southern California, and I went to Hebrew school. It's before day schools were invented, and I went to Hebrew school. I was that odd kid who actually liked Hebrew school. Not because I was such a big student of Torah. It's because I have 3 brothers, and so the only place in the world where I could meet girls was a Hebrew school. And so it was that I would come from regular school every day and have a snack and go to Hebrew school, and I would plant myself next to any one female in the class and strike up a conversation with these wonderfully strange and remarkable creatures, and I would spend the whole time of Hebrew school chatting up this young woman. And the teacher would look at me, and all of our teachers, all of them were either European refugees, or most likely Israeli sergeants from the Israeli army. And my teacher would look at me, and she would give me, at 15 minutes into the class, she would say, Yitzchak, sheket. Yitzchak is my Hebrew name. And sheket, of course, means like, shut up. And I would say, Kain Mara, Kain, beseder. And I would go back to talking to this young woman because nothing was going to deter me. And 15 minutes later, she would say, Yitzchak, sheket. And I would say, Kain Mara, Kain, ani, beseder, I'll be quiet. And then finally, the third one would come and she'd say, Yitzchak, la sifriya, go to the library. Now, the synagogue had a pretty good library. And it's really where I learned to love Jewish books, because I went to the library and I had the whole time to sit in the library and read my way through a synagogue library, which was just wonderful. Nobody bothered me until about 6 o'clock, half an hour before Hebrew school was over. And that's when all the old guys from the minyan would come in. And no matter how small and young I was, they recruited me and they taught me to smoke cigars and drink schnapps and tell jokes with Yiddish punchlines and daven mincha mariv. And that was my Jewish education until about the middle of 4th grade, when I came into class one day and I got my first Yitzchak Sheket, and my second Yitzchak Sheket, and my third Yitzchak Sheket La Sifriya. And as I'm packing up my books to get to the library, she stops me at the door with the words that will bring a chill to the spine of any young Hebrew school student. Rega, she says, wait a minute. Kain Mora? Yes, teacher? She says, do something for me in the library. I say, fine, anything you want. What would you like me to do? And she says, write a book report. I go, okay, I can write a book report. I like book reports. I've been writing book reports for years. No problem. Any particular book, or can I just choose one off the shelf? And she gets a sly, conspiratorial smile on her face, and she says, yeah, write about the Bible. Write a book report about the Bible. I say, write a book report about the Bible? How can you write a book report about the Bible? She says, it's a book, right? I say, yeah, then you can write a book report. Have it ready 6:30 or you don't go home. So I trudge off to the library and I take a piece of 4th grade writing paper. Remember the paper with the thick lines and a number 3 pencil, and I put my name at the top, Yitzchak Sheket, right? And then I put the outline of a book report, title of the book. I cheated a little bit. I took just the Torah. So far, so good. Author. Okay. Unknown. That's fair. Publisher, Jewish Publication Society, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And then the list of questions that one asks for a book report. Setting of the book. Somewhere in the Middle East. Main character of the book. Well, certainly the main character of the Torah is God. So I write down God. And then you go through all the, plot of the book, resolution of the plot, and then, what does this book teach? And then the all-important last question, would you recommend this book to your friends? Can you write a book report about the Bible? I realize I've spent most of my adult life trying to write that book report. I've tried to find I've spent most of my adult life trying to figure out what is the narrative arc of the Jewish tradition? What is its deepest message? What is it trying to say to human life? We don't ask that question typically. Typically, we ask a question about a certain parsha of the Torah, or a certain Megillah, a certain book read on a holiday, or a certain verse, or a certain halacha, a certain law. But to ask the global question, what is the narrative arc of Jewish faith? What is the deepest message of Jewish religion and culture? Is a question we don't typically ask. And the reason we don't typically ask, there are many reasons. First of all, because there's a prejudice in Jewish tradition for the questions that begin with the word how, rather than the begin with the word why. Look at the Pesach Seder. The kid who asks the question, what are all the laws and traditions that we have to fulfill at the Seder? He's called the Chacham. But the kid who asks the question, Ma ze lachem? What's this all mean to you? How does the narrative of slavery and freedom and liberation, how does that fit? How does that find a place in your personal narrative, in your personal identity? How does that affect your personal ethics? That kid is castigated as the Rasha, as the evil one, the wicked one. And it isn't, by the way, the ostensible reason in the Midrash because he says lachem, because if you look carefully at the verse that describes the wise child, he also says etchem, you. It's because he asks that why question, and the why questions make us feel very uncomfortable. But there's a very particular reason we have to answer his question, and it's right there in that very same Midrash. It's the fourth kid, she'eno yodea lishol, the one who sits mute and quiet at the table. What kind of Jew doesn't ask a question? What kind of Jew doesn't at least ask, what page are we on, or when do we eat? No, that's not what he is. He's not mute out of a loss of ability or capability. He's mute because yesterday he was the Rasha. Because yesterday he came to our table, he came to our synagogues, he came to our classes, he came to our Jewish community, and he said, okay, what does all this mean to you? What is the deep message of this faith? And we called him a Rasha and castigated him, and we marginalized him. And sitting there on the periphery of the Seder table, he learned his lesson. He sits quietly and silently at the edge of the table. And now I recognize him. She'eno yodea lishol, the marginalized Jew. In the 2013 Pew study of American Jewish identity, they found 5.5 million American Jews. And when they asked those 5.5 million American Jews, what is your current religion? Fully 20% checked the box labeled none. Not Jewish, not Christian, not Muslim, not Orthodox, not conservative, not Reform, not Reconstructionist, not Renewal, not Zionist, not un-Zionist, none. None Jews. Jews of no particular religious persuasion. Because when they come to us and say to us, Ma ze lachem, what does this mean to you? What is the message? What is the deepest truth that your faith is kind to teach me? What is the truth that you identify with, that you fight for? What is the truth at the heart of being Jewish? We have nothing to say. Well, it's time we had something to say. So I went looking for something to say. I went back to the sources of the tradition. Now, the hardest thing about reading the sources of the tradition isn't that they're opaque. The hardest part is that we've read them already, and we already know what they're going to say. We've read them many times, and we've heard many rabbis' sermons about them, and we already know all the caveats and all of the nuances and all of the nooks and crannies of these stories. So the task before us is to read them for the first time, to open our eyes and be surprised by what we find in these sources. So what do we find in the sources? When we open the Bible, when we open the Torah, the very first character we meet is a character named God. And what is so odd about this character, literarily, is that we know nothing about this character named God. We don't know where he came from. We don't know what he's made of. We don't know what he's about. We only know two things about this character named God. Number one, God creates. And number two, God dreams. What does God create? A whole world. Piece by piece, God creates a whole world. But you can see from the process of creation that there is a curriculum here. There's a plan. And the plan is a world of oneness. A world where everything fits together. A world where everything is symbiotic with everything else. That's why there's a distinct order to creation. And at the very end of the process of creation, what does God want? One other creature who will appreciate the dream and appreciate the oneness of the world that God has created. So God creates a human being, different from any other creature. This creature is created in the divine image. We are creators ourselves and endowed with the capacity to understand the divine dream and to carry it forward. And God puts us in a garden. Now that's an interesting caveat, isn't it? Why a garden? Why not a palace or a shopping mall or a metropolis? Why a garden? Because a garden is the most beautiful symbol of oneness. It is a place where artifice and nature come together to create a symbiosis where life can thrive. And we're put into that garden and given a task as we go in. The Torah says, L'shamra u'la'avda, to protect it and to cultivate it. If you ever wondered what the purpose of human existence is, there it is. Your purpose is to cultivate and protect God's creation. We're put into the garden to cultivate this creation and further the task of creating a world of oneness. But something catastrophic happens in that garden. Because what God didn't count on is there's a counter impulse within us. We not only want to be bonded into the world of oneness, we want to have our own place. We want to be independent. Even in paradise, we want to pull our own strings. And so man and woman rebel against God in order to be the people they most want to be. And that rebellion turns us in a direction of looking out only for ourselves. It's the ego that stands up and screams, me, instead of the one. And that ego grows and grows until God is fed up with this creature who has filled God's world with violence and selfishness and mendacity. And God says, to hell with it, I'm going to destroy it all. And at the end of the first Torah portion, which is read in October, at the end of that Torah portion, God is ready to destroy it all. I'm a baker by hobby. And there are times when I screw up a recipe. I've mixed up salt for sugar. I've forgotten the yeast in the bread. And what you do at that point is you bury it at the bottom of the rubbish so no one knows you made it. And that's what God intends to do. And just before he's about to destroy it all, his eye catches one human being with moral potential. That's right, Noah. And God says, he has possibilities. He has possibilities. I couldn't create a human being to be my partner in bringing a world of oneness to be. Perhaps I can choose one. And so he chooses Noah, wipes away the whole world, and the world starts over again. But as Noah comes out of the ark, we all know what happens. He can't handle it. He can't handle the responsibility. And that impulse within human beings to scream, me, 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 asserts itself once again and once again at the end of the second week of the year. That's a tough book to read. At the end of the second week, God's heart is broken. And now we come to the third. God says to God's self, I couldn't create a human being as my partner to bring a world of oneness. I couldn't choose one. Maybe I can teach one. And God goes looking for someone to teach. Now, there's a huge midrashic tradition about why God chose Abram. But I know the real answer. The real answer is his name began with an A. If his name was Zachary, he'd been at the end of the line. God chooses randomly. It's eeny, meeny, miny, you. You're the one. You're the one who's going to carry forward my dream. Because the idea is you choose one human being who is distinguished, but not by anything that other human beings don't carry. And see if you can train him to be a partner with the divine. So I'm going to open the screen. We're going to take a look at a text together. I sure hope to God this works. I hope you can see it. So now we open Genesis 12. Act 1, God tries to create a human partner. Act 2, God tries to choose a human partner. Act 3, the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your land, your birthplace, from your father's house to the land that I will show you. Leave behind everything. Leave behind your identity. Leave behind your power. Leave behind your person. Leave behind everything and follow me to a new life. And I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I'll make your name great, and you be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and through you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Now notice this very carefully. Every ancient mythology has the same story. Every single one. Every single one. Read Joseph Campbell. He wrote a whole book about this. We have it in Mesopotamian mythologies. We have it in Greco-Roman mythologies. We have it in Polynesian mythologies. We have it in Navajo mythologies. Every mythology has a story of the God who chooses a human being and makes that human being a partner and says, with you, we will conquer the whole world. And the Bible knows you've read Joseph Campbell. So it's going to parody and play off of your knowing. It's going to play off of your knowing. And what is the Bible going to say? The man is told, leave behind the life you live and the life you know and follow me. And I'll make of you a great nation. No, that's great. All the gods say that. And I'll bless you. That's terrific as well. And I'll make your name great. You'll be famous. There's only one ancient mythology that has the next line. Because the next line in all the other mythologies are, you and I will conquer the world, and you will rule, and I will be God over the world. And that's not what God says. Here's the surprise, and this is pretty typical of biblical literature. Something you're familiar with, something you're familiar with, something you're familiar with, and then a surprise. And here's the surprise. Hayeh bracha. We're not going to conquer the world. You're going to become a blessing to the world. You are a vessel of divine blessing in the world. This is the job description of the Jewish people. This is what's expected of all of us. This is what every bar and bat mitzvah should be told on that fateful day they stand in front of us. I hope you go to Princeton or Yale or Harvard or Stanford or wherever. I hope you are a material success in the world. I hope you get all of your dreams. But that isn't relevant here in the synagogue. In the synagogue, what's relevant about your personal development is that you are a blessing. I will know that I have succeeded as your teacher, as your rabbi, on the day that someone mentions your name and someone rolls their eyes and says, "Ah, that person, she, he, is my blessing." I know what it is to say a blessing. Imagine what it is to be a blessing, to be present to someone in that moment of life when they most needed companionship, support, generosity, and love, to be present at the right moment, to be a blessing. That's what we are called upon to be. Now, in the Bible, whenever anything is important is said, it's always said twice. That's why rabbis are so redundant, right? So here God is going to modify what God just said. I will bless those who bless you. That's nice. I will curse those who curse you. That's even better. I have that on a bumper sticker on my car. V'nivrechu b'cha kol mishpachot adama, and in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Notice what God doesn't say. God doesn't say, be a blessing to me. No, you're to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. So my question, and this is the first question on the quiz, is this the greatest statement of Jewish particularism or the greatest statement of Jewish universalism? Is this the greatest statement of our chosenness as a people, our distinction, our exceptionalism as a people? Or is this the greatest statement of our responsibility to the world outside of our circle? And if you said yes, you got the answer right. Because this is both. You can't conceive of Jewish particularity without conceiving of Jewish universalism, and you can't conceive of Jewish universalism without its foundation in Jewish particularity. And here is the evidence. But now we've just been introduced to the most radical idea. It's an idea that Abraham Joshua Heschel spent books and books and books teaching us about. What is God saying? God is saying to a human being, I need you. I cannot complete the work of creation without you. I need you to take a role in creation. I want to assert to you that this is what I call chutzpah. Now, the word chutzpah we're all familiar with. It's a Yiddish word, and it means temerity or nerve or cheek. You know, the famous clinical definition was that the guy who kills his parents and then throws himself on the mercy of the court as an orphan. And that was funny until somebody actually did it once. And now the question, but this is a different meaning. The word chutzpah is actually much older than Yiddish. It goes all the way back to the Talmud. It's actually an Aramaic word. And while temerity and cheekiness is the insolence sometime even, is the ostensible definition, there is a secondary definition which is much more important. It's what Rabbi Debra has just talked to us about. In the Talmud, chutzpah means irrepressible life, irrepressible strength. The Talmud Yerushalmi says the land of Israel is possessed with the quality of chutzpah because no matter how many times it's been conquered, it flowers every springtime. There is something within us, planted within us, which seeks this special quality. And this special quality of human empowerment and human responsibility, the unique and precious role that the Torah assigns to the human being in the world, and in the particular case to the Jew in the world. This I represent as chutzpah, and this I would submit is the deepest message and lesson of our tradition. This is the truth our tradition was created to teach. Because there's so much in the world that seeks to defeat our sense of empowerment, that seeks to make us small, to reduce our dreams, to lower the horizons of human potential. And here is a tradition that says we refuse to accept that. We are empowered and we are responsible. And that is the source of our dignity. And that is our source of the sense that our lives matter in any way. That's what makes it worth getting up in the morning and fighting for what's right. Now let's take a look at another text together. Once God has said to the human being, I need you. Now the Torah is going to ask, really? Seriously? What does it mean for an infinite God of creation to need the human being? How far are you willing to go with that claim? And the next text is my favorite chapter of Scripture, because it is a test case of how far the Torah is willing to take this remarkable idea. Now remember, Abraham is waiting for a kid. He wants to have a child, and he takes the maid to have a child with the maid. Please don't try this at home. It didn't work for him, and it certainly won't work for you. And finally, on the day after his circumcision, 3 angels come to him. And the first one says, Mazel tov, you and Sarah are going to be parents. And of course, Sarah says, have you seen my old man? And God says, watch, I can do miracles. And a baby is coming. And now 2 angels are left. And here's the story. Genesis 18, verse 16. The men set out from there, looked down towards Sodom. Abraham lives in Hebron. It's on the edge of Hebron, so you can look down into the Rift Valley. And that's where Sodom was. Abraham walking with them to see them off. Now, verse 17. Now the Lord had said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? Who is God talking to? Well, God is talking to himself. God is talking to God. God is ruminating. And what's the question? Do I owe this human being an explanation? Now, what's the ostensible answer to that question? The ostensible answer to that question is, of course you don't offer him an explanation. You don't owe anybody an explanation. You're God. What fun is it to be God if you got to explain yourself to people? I mean, here are your poor rabbis. They have to explain themselves to a board of directors. I have to explain myself to my wife. All of us are accountable to somebody. But God's God. God doesn't have to go around explaining himself to anybody. God doesn't have to tell his wife what time he's going to be home from work, right? What fun is it to be God? But that's the point. Once God has entered into a working covenant with a human being as a partner, there has to be a common moral understanding between the two. That's the remarkable revolution of covenantal theology. Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm going to do? Abraham is to become great and populous. The whole world is to bless himself by him. I've singled him out to do what is just and right. He has to know divine justice and righteousness. God and man have to share a common moral language. And that is the ostensible basis for the next conversation. So jump with me to verse 23. Abraham came forward and said, and here's the speech, and this is such a remarkable speech. Will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there be 50 innocent in the city? Will you wipe out the place and not forgive it for the sake of the innocent 50 in it? Chalila lecha. Far be it from you to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as the guilty, so that innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth do justly? This is remarkable. If this weren't written here, you couldn't have imagined this. The human being steps before the creator of all and says, wait a minute, you can't do that. You can't do that, because the moral code that we share prevents that from happening. Will you sweep away the innocent from the guilty? You want a world of justice. You want a world of righteousness. You can't go ahead and destroy the city. What if they're innocent, 50 innocent? Will you wipe out the place and not spare it? And look at verse 25. This is the kicker. The Hebrew is chalila lecha, which the great translator H.L. Ginsberg, who went to school in London and spoke a beautiful British English, translates it's far be it from you. But that's not what it is. Anyone here have a Yiddish-speaking grandmother? I did. And when my parents would go away and leave my brothers and me in the care of my bubby, and we would start a fight with each other and beat the life out of each other, Bubby would come into the room and wouldn't, she was 4'3", little Lithuanian lady. She didn't have to scream. All she had to do was give me the look. You know that look that your Bubby gives you? Like, I'm so disappointed in you. You are so not the person I thought you should be. She didn't even have to say a word. Then she would say 3 Yiddish words. She would say, Shanda and the Cherpa, which means shame on you. I expected so much more of you. And then she would shake her head and she would go, Feh. And I would fall to the ground on my knees and beg, Bubby, please forgive me. That's what Abraham says to God. I expected more of you. You disappoint me. It says, Chalila chameasot davar kaze. You would do such a thing? La'amit rasha'im tzadikim rasha. You would kill indiscriminately the innocent and the guilty, the evil and the good, the right and the wrong. And then the phrase is, V'haya katzadik karasha. So that evil and good, right and wrong, innocent and guilty, have the same fate, there's no moral discrimination in your world. That's the world you wanted. That's the world you created. Chalila lacha. God forbid. Hashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat. You would not do justice. Now, here's the reason I'm Jewish. Because you know what the next thing should be? The next thing should be, God should smash him like a bug. Really. Because what does God need this tsaras for? I mean, my God. I mean, what do you need a man telling you how to run the universe? But God knows that having fought back on behalf of justice, God is willing in the Torah to compromise the prerogatives of divine authority in order to reaffirm the divine dream of a world of justice. And so God says, okay, you're right. Fine. You find 50, I'll forgive the place. And now Abraham, who has sold enough camels in the shuk of Beersheba, now Abraham knows he's got a live one in a shop. Because if God would say 50, now we can do a little business. And now the bargaining begins. And the next section I can only characterize as biblical humor. Because only somebody with a profound sense of humor could have written this next text, because now Abraham starts to handle. He starts to bargain. He says, you know what? Okay, 50. You said 50. What if 5 are missing? You said 50, so 5 couldn't be a problem. So let's say 45. Can we agree on 45? Do I hear 40? Can I see 40 somewhere in the room? Is there a 40 somewhere in the room? I see a 40 in the corner. Do I hear a 30? Can I see a 20? Is there a 20? Can I see a 20? There's a 20. Can I see a 10? 10 going once, 10 going twice, 10 sold to the God of the universe. If it wasn't written, you wouldn't believe that such a text could be here. Because it's such a humorous, it's such a ridiculous, absurd text. But what the Bible is playing with is the idea that once a human being has internalized the divine dream of a world of justice and is willing to stand fast in front of an authority, even an authority as terrifying as a God of the universe, then God is willing to step back and say, you got it, you win. You win. Now, what's remarkable about this text, and I'll just take a moment for a digression, is that there's a counter text. I happen to believe that it's not just the Talmud that's written in machloket, in arguments. The Bible itself is written that way. You just got to go find the counter text, because they're not always right next to the text you're reading. And the counter text to this is a book that we Jews don't read very often. It's called Job. The book of Job is a book in Ketuvim. It's the end of the Hebrew Bible. It's in our Bible. A lot of people think it happens to be in their Bible, but it's in our Bible. And it's about a man who suffers terribly. We know from the first 2 chapters that he didn't deserve any of the suffering. He too was a righteous man. And he was on the wrong side he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. There's a bet that Satan, who was the prosecutor, made with God. And poor Job suffers terribly. Now, you've heard of the expression of the patience of Job. That lasts 2-3 chapters. For the next 35 chapters, this man screams to God, how can you do this to me? And his neighbors come. Neighbors like these, you don't need. Because they come and they try to justify God. They tried to tell Job, you deserve your own suffering. And this is the countertext to Abraham's argument. Because where Abraham is arguing to God, listen to the book of Job. Here in the 9th chapter, Job says, I know it's so, man cannot win a suit against God. If he insisted on a trial with him, he would not answer one charge in 1,000. Wise of heart and mighty in power, whoever challenged God and came out whole. Whoever said to him, what are you doing? Right? Though I were in the right, I could not speak. I would plead for mercy. If I summoned him, he wouldn't respond. If I brought God to trial, if I summoned him in a citation, would God come? And then Job, exhausted and distraught, finishes this speech by saying, and therefore it is all one. He destroys the blameless and the guilty. You can see this is the opposite story. This is a man who says that God is behaving just as Abraham accused him of. This is the God that Abraham was so afraid of. Now I'll jump to the end. We could spend a whole week learning this book, but let's take to the very end. What happens at the very end? Well, God shows up. It's got that kind of an ending. God shows up. Job's been screaming for 35 chapters, and God shows up. Just chapter 38. The Lord replied to Job out of the tempest. That's interesting, by the way, because God talks to Elijah in a still small voice, right? God talks to Abraham. God talks to Isaiah, to Jeremiah. But when God talks to Job, it's in a hurricane. So you imagine the power of a hurricane. I think there's actually one headed for New Jersey soon. So I think you may to experience this. Who is this who darkens counsel, speaking without knowledge? Gird your loins like a man. I'll ask and you inform me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Speak if you have understanding. Do you know who fixed its dimensions, onto what its bases were sunk? God says to Job, who do you think you are to question me? Who do you think you are? Who do you think? Remember Robert De Niro in Taxi Driver, right? You talking to me? Who do you think you are? You're just a human being. You're nobody. You have no right to accuse me of anything. You have no moral standing. You have no moral voice in this conversation. And what happens at the end of the book? I'm sorry, I'm going to give it away. The Lord said in reply to Job, shall one who should be disciplined complain against Shaddai? He who arraigns God must respond. And Job says in reply, I know you can do everything, that nothing you propose is impossible for you. Who is this obscures counsel without knowledge? Indeed, I spoke without understanding of things beyond me which I did not know. Here now I will speak. I will ask, you inform me. I had heard you with my ears. I see you with my eyes. Therefore I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes. There's only 2 places in the entire Hebrew Bible where a person describes himself as dust and ashes. This chapter and in Abraham's story, in Genesis 18. Here, dust and ashes is a description of the insignificance, not the physical, but the moral insignificance of a human being. A human being who accepts his role as being a nothing in the world, who has no voice to complain to God. But if you look above, if we go back up to Abraham in chapter 18, what does it mean there? Look at verse 27. Here I venture to speak, my Lord, I who am dust and ashes, but what if the 50 lack 5? In the Abraham story, it's ironic. I may be just dust and ashes physically, but as your covenantal partner, I have a moral voice. This is the difference between the 2 books. You ever notice that there's no Jewish kid named Job? I mean, I've taught Hebrew school for 50 years. I got kids named Mordechai and Sarah and Abraham and all kinds of interesting names, Israeli names, Osnat and Snira and all sorts of interesting names. I've never met a Jewish kid named Job. You want to know why? Because Job is not a Hebrew name. Because Job is not a Jewish story originally. The name Job is much older than the Bible. It comes from the Akkadian. The earliest Mesopotamian civilization that learned how to write was the Akkadian civilization, the Sumerians. And in Akkadian mythology, the story of Job occurs something like the one we have in the Bible. And in ancient Akkadian, you know what Job means? It means any man, every man, John Doe. It's the cipher for the common human experience. And the common human experience is that we meet God in nature. And when you stand in front of the hurricane or you stand in front of the earthquake, you don't question its justice. You just get the hell out of the way. That's how Job experiences God. A God of nature has no morality. But Abraham is different. He's covenanted. And as a covenanted human being, he is not only permitted, he is expected to challenge any authority, including the divine itself, including God himself, in the name of divine justice. And that's the chutzpah of the Jewish tradition, to stand for justice in a world against any authority, to stand for justice and to ask the question and to demand something more of life, and not to shrink back and accept injustice as the way things are. I've often told my students that the opposite of Judaism is not atheism or skepticism or doubt, or God forbid Christianity or Islam. The opposite of Judaism is the person who says there's nothing we can do. It's the person who's prepared to accept moral surrender as the end of the argument. The one who says what is what inevitably must be, and there's nothing we can do about it. Moral surrender is to give up the mantle of the Jewish tradition, but it is also to accept a very, very sad life, a life of despair in the face of injustice. Now, we can continue in this vein and talk about the way that the human being is perceived in the rest of the Bible, in the rest of the rabbinic tradition, and the Jewish mystical and philosophical traditions. I actually wrote a book about this, but I think this captures the best of it. Let me just say two more things before we finish, because I know what you're all thinking. You'll say, yeah, but wait a minute, there's another story. All right, just so that you make sure that I know that there's another story, there it is. Here's the story. And what happens in this story when God says to Avram Avinu, take your son, your only one, to the land of Moriah and kill him. The story of the Akedah, in a certain sense, is the God that Abraham most feared in the other story coming to haunt him. It's the God of Job. This is the Job God. This is the God of moral indistinction. This is the God of moral confusion, a God who demands the death of a child who's been promised, the death of a covenant that's been established. And the only answer I can offer you here is, yes, that's true. The Torah is giving us the Job story, and Abraham is experiencing it. But before you abandon this, take a look at what the rabbis did here. This is a version of a midrash that occurs in the Tanchuma that's retold by Elie Wiesel in his brilliant book, Messengers of God. It has to do with one little anomaly in the story. You'll see the anomaly if you look with me in the Akedah story here in Genesis 22. Look at verse 11. The kid is bound on the altar. Abraham is raising the knife over his son's heart. And the angel of God called to him and said from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. And he says, do not raise your hand against the boy or do anything to now I know that you fear God. That's the angel talking, right? Now look what happens next. Since you've not withheld your son, your favored one, from me. Somehow in the middle of that sentence, it's not the angel talking anymore, it's God talking. Well, the rabbis are invited into the text. And the rabbis are wondering, which God do I want to worship? Which God do I want to live with? Which Abraham is my hero? Listen to what they do to the Akedah story. When God sent the angel to restrain Abraham, he refused to heed the call. God himself ordered me to sacrifice my son. It's up to him to rescind the order. So the first thing is, Abraham says, I'm killing the kid. I'm killing the kid, right? Only the boss gives me orders, right? And there's actually a beautiful Rembrandt woodcut of this scene where you can see the angel trying to wrestle the knife out of Abraham's arms because he's trying to push the knife into the kid's heart. And finally, God shows up and retracts the commandment. But Abraham struggles to continue. With the knife at the throat of his son, he begins to argue. He says, listen here, God, you listen to me or the kid gets it. God says, okay, calm down. I swear I shall not leave this altar, Lord, before I speak my mind. Speak, says God. Didn't you promise me my descendants would be as the stars in the sky? Yes, I promise you. And whose descendants? Mine alone? No, they'll be Isaac's. And didn't you promise me they would inherit the earth? Yes, I promised you that. And whose descendants? Mine alone? No, they'll be Isaac's as well. Well then, my Lord, said Abraham. Could have pointed out to you before that your order contradicted your promise. I could have spoken up, but I didn't. I contained my grief and held my tongue, and in return, I want you to make me this promise, that when in the future my children and children's children throughout the generations act against your law and against your will, you will also say nothing and forgive them. So be it, God agreed. Let them but retell this tale, and they will be forgiven. Why do we read the Akedah, this story of the sacrifice of Isaac, on Rosh Hashanah? It's not because of the ram. It's because of this midrash. Because every time we tell the story, and what story? Not the story of the Akedah, but the fact that Abraham turned to God and said, you promised me, and I will not accept injustice as the last word. It's because the Jewish people have pledged themselves to lives of chutzpah, to challenging authority on behalf of God's own dream of justice, even if we have to challenge God himself. That God says, I'll forgive you generation to generation and keep you alive in the world. My thesis in this book and in this talk, and I think it's appropriate today with all that goes on about us, is that this is the eternal job of the Jewish people, and this is the truth we've been sent into the world to teach. There's so many forces in this world that are trying to teach people that they don't have the capacity to heal the world, that we don't have the capacity to meet the intractable problems of the community, that we can't solve the problems of poverty or racism, that we can't solve the problems of global climate change, that we can't solve the problems of war and hatred, that we can't do it. And the Jewish tradition insists, week after week as we read the Torah, that we can, and we will, and we are responsible to do so. And that is the great truth that we've been sent into the world to teach. So, would I recommend this book to my friends? With all my heart. I thank you for listening tonight. I'd be glad to answer some questions from the rabbis and teachers of your community, as well as from anyone in the community who'd like to share a question. Thank you.
Yasher Koach, thank you so much, Rabbi Feinstein. I want everybody to know that I had the immense pleasure and merit to take a homiletics class in my last year rabbinical school with Rabbi Feinstein. So I got to hear lectures like these weekly. I was very fortunate. My first question, Rabbi Feinstein, is how are we doing? How are we doing today in terms of living up to that legacy, that promise that you spoke so eloquently is endowed in our tradition to each one of us? Are we helping to fulfill God's dream in the world? And if not, what can we be doing better and how?
My dear friend, student, and now colleague, Rabbi Marder, the answer to that question is going to be your Rosh Hashanah sermon. And I mean that quite sincerely. First of all, because you belong to a generation after mine, this responsibility will soon be passed to you, in the same way that the beloved Rabbi Orenstein passed it to Deborah and to me, and to the rabbis of our generation. And second of all, because you have fresh eyes to see this circumstance, and I really think that's exactly the question that we need to be asking ourselves collectively. One of the big differences that I'll point to, without answering the question, I'm going to evade the question very, very skillfully. But one of the big differences is that in our generation, Jews have come to power. For about 1800 years as a diaspora people, we possessed only spiritual power. The power to preserve Torah, to protect Torah, to grow, v'yagdil Torah v'yadir, to enhance the Torah. And we created this vast and beautiful and powerful literature of halacha and midrash, of piyut and tefillah, of mysticism and philosophy. And that literature is our heritage and our legacy and the beautiful gift of those who came before us. But it's in our time that Jews have come to power, and they've come to power in two ways. We've come to power in a sovereign expression in the state of Israel. And the state of Israel has to become, as it has to protect itself. That's the number one thing, because its first purpose is to defend and protect the Jewish people. But it has to do so in a manner, and it has to continue to be a moral beacon to the world. And look, we're all proud of that. When there's an earthquake in Haiti and it's the Israelis who were the first ones on the scene, when the research on this coronavirus is led by Israeli researchers, we all take great pride in this, because we have a sense that to heal and help the world, to do tikkun, is something that Israel exists to do, and not simply to exist as any other nation. So in its sovereign expression, Israel has to do this. And then the other expression of that is here in the diaspora, and particularly here in America and Canada and other liberal democracies where Jewish people have taken power. And I think it's a remarkable thing that there are 3 Jews who sit on the Supreme Court of the United States of America. I think it's a remarkable thing that in the last election, whichever of the candidates you liked or detested, both of them had Jewish children, right? But I mean, it's remarkable, that we have come to the center of American life and the center of American power, and we are able to not control, God forbid, but we're able to influence the directions of American culture and American politics, American economics, the American society in directions that are consistent, if we choose to consistent with the values of our faith and our tradition. So the fact that we've come to power places even more responsibility on us. When we were powerless, we could say, look, what do you want us to do? The Goyim run the world. But now we're at the core of power. So now the question is, what do we do with that power, and how do we use it to effectuate these remarkable dreams that we've inherited from our ancestors? And that, my dear student and friend, is going to be your Rosh Hashanah sermon. And I encourage everyone at Bethel to tune in September and listen to the rabbi's answer to the question.
Thank you for giving me a topic. I wasn't sure, what to talk about yet. Now thanks to you, have a topic.
Rabbi Marder will have her writing done by next week.
Absolutely. From Marion Sender, how does the Job story show us how to repair the world, if it does?
I believe it doesn't. That's the point. I believe that Job is homo naturus, is the natural human being. And the natural human being sees a world which does not accept his moral critique. And that's what God says to him. When God takes him on a tour of the natural world and says, where were you when I taught lions to roar? And where were you when I taught horses to gallop? And where were you when I taught fish to swim? What the Bible is trying to say is that nature does not resonate with human moral complaint, with the human moral claim. It's the natural world is not going to give you morality unless you manipulate it to do so. So we have to do tikkun, and that's what science is all about. I mean, what does it mean to find a vaccine for the coronavirus? It means to manipulate our understanding of nature in order to produce something which will protect us from this malady. And that's exactly the moral task that Abraham is asking us to take up. The Job story is ultimately a story, I think, and it's my reading of it, and I know there are people who disagree with, and they're always Jews, right? But I think that the Job story is a story that enshrines and welcomes moral quietism. Shah still, be nice, be quiet, don't make too much noise, God will find you. I don't think that's Jewish. I think that the Job story is not, in the end, not a Jewish story, at least in my experience. Now, look, there are moments, we rabbis know these moments, when acceptance, an ethic of acceptance is what's called for. There's a moment when the doctor says there's nothing else we can do, and we call for hospice care. That's a Job moment. It's when quietism and acceptance is the ethical way to proceed. There are moments when we have to accept, no doubt about it. But typically, we Jews rage against the injustice in the world. And Job, I think, is the opposite case. Job to me, ends with this undignified surrender. I don't think a Jew can read the end of Job and find solace there. I think a Jew enjoys the dignity of Abraham. Now, Abraham's life is a lot more tumultuous. You want peace of mind, you want a peaceful life, you want a nice, quiet life in South Orange, New Jersey. No one dray a cup, no one's going to bother you. Then read the book of Job and enjoy the end. Abraham forces you to get up and scream about the injustices of the world. And sometimes those injustices are difficult to solve and intractable, and they take generations to solve. But the only payoff is that if you want a life of dignity in the end, then you got to follow Abraham. Because Abraham's protest against the injustice gives us a life that really matters, a life that really has significance, a life where we can say, I fought the good fight, and I believe there's dignity in that. There's dignity in that. So you have to decide what you want, tranquility or dignity. And frankly, I've never thought of tranquility as a Jewish virtue, right? So I don't think the book of Job in the end gives us a way. I think Abraham gives us the way.
Rabbi Feinstein, I'm wondering to jump in for a second. The book of Job is one of the few books that we're permitted to learn on Tisha B'Av, on a day when that focuses on destruction, but specifically a day that focuses on sinat chinam, destruction caused by immorality, by our hatred towards one another for no reason at all. And I know we're attempting to sort of reinterpret what rabbinic tradition is trying to, or how rabbinic tradition is trying to make sense of a book of Tanakh as divine word, even if that's not how we understand it to be. But I'm wondering your thoughts on that, on a day of deep mourning, which speaks to mourning caused by injustice, why we then sit with those words of Job.
That's a wonderful question, Rabbi, and I appreciate your question as I appreciate Rabbi Marder's wonderful question too. I think that the day of Tisha B'Av is the day when we internalize the terrible, terrible evil that has come to befall the Jewish people over the generations. The destruction of the Beit HaMikdash twice, the exiles, the massacres, all of the things that have given us so much pain. And if you look in the tradition at the answers, that is, what is the tradition? What tools does the tradition give us to answer the question, why me? Why us? You as a rabbi, you know this better than anyone. How many times have you and I sat in the waiting room of the oncology clinic, or in the hospital ICU room, or in the cemetery waiting room, and tried to answer a child or a family member's question, why my mom, why my dad, why me, right? And we have in the tradition a variety of tools to answer that question. There isn't one standard catechism. Jews don't have a catechism. So one of the answers to the question, of course, is the question given at the end of Genesis when Joseph's brothers come to him and they say, don't kill us. And Joseph says, no, you intended it evil. God gave us good. We say that there's a plan and that God controls the world and this has to come out good. That's one of the answers. I don't find that helpful, but that's one of the answers that you hear. It's when the preacher at the funeral says, he's in a better place now. And one of the other answers is the answer of Job, which says we just don't know and can't ask God that question because we don't have a way of understanding enough the ways of God in the world. And that's another answer to the question of evil. I also find that very disconcerting. But there are others who find great comfort in that. To say, I believe in a God who controls the world, and I just will never know why God does what God does. And some people, and that's the book of Job. I mean, Job says, God says to Job, shut up. And Job says, okay. Just okay. And there's another answer, which is the one you're giving, which is a different answer, which is sinus chinam, which is to say, our destruction and the evil the evil that we absorbed, the evil that we suffered, really we deserved it. I mean, it was a punishment, or it came our way as a consequence of our choices. That's a different answer. You and I would never give that answer to a family suffering from, say, cancer. I mean, we would never say you deserved it. God forbid. We'd never say that, because that doubles the pain. right? But in certain circumstances, to say, you know what, we made mistakes. If we hadn't hated each other, I mean, this is what, Josephus points this out, and the Talmud seconds the motion that if we had gotten our act together, we could have repelled the Romans and not lost Jerusalem. And it was our own fault that we lost Jerusalem. So this is a different way of understanding evil, right? Me personally, I tend to follow Harold Kushner, Harold Schoweiss, and ultimately Mordechai Kaplan in their way of answering the question, which says that God isn't responsible for everything that happens to us, that we are, and that sometimes that God wishes us to do the right thing, and sometimes we do, and sometimes we don't. And I find that a better answer. But you and I know that there are circumstances that justify each of those answers, and our job is to bring strength and comfort to our people. So that's why Job is read on Tisha B'Av. It's one of the answers. When you ask why we Jews have to suffer, the answer is you can't ask God that question, right? That's one of the answers. I don't like that answer, but that's one of the answers. I like the Sinas Chinam answer, right? Because making Jews feel guilty is a traditional way of making Jews understand why bad stuff happens to them. My mother taught me that.
Leonard Levine is wondering, at the end of Mishnah Sota, he says that at the footsteps of the Messiah, Chutzpah is supposed to increase. And he's wondering how you might understand this.
In that case, it means, in that particular context, it means insolence. And what the rabbis are saying there is that, there's two theories of the Messiah. You all know this, right? One theory is the Messiah, when things get worse and worse and worse and worse, and when they can't get any more worse, that's when Mashiach comes and bails us out. That's the sort of Noah's Ark theory, right? The history comes to an end in a dark black hole, and then God redeems us. And that's where that tradition comes from. When insolence and arrogance rules the world, then God says, okay, enough, game's over. I prefer the other tradition. The other tradition is an ameliorist tradition, which says we take a step toward Mashiach every day if we find one way of doing tikkun in the world. And step by step, tikkun by tikkun. And sometimes those steps are painfully slow. And there's 2 steps backwards for every step forward. But the other tradition is that we bring Messiah step by step. And when we bring tikkun to the world, step by step by step by step, then Mashiach comes. And of course, in the Gemara, one of the rabbis say, yeah, but we won't need him anymore because we'll have made the world perfect. And the other rabbis say, And then there's my favorite rabbinic text. And my favorite rabbinic text says, if you're planting a tree and someone comes running along screaming, Mashiach is here, Mashiach is here, Mashiach is here, what do? You finish planting the tree. Then go see if it's true. Which is to say, yes, step by step we will bring the Mashiach, tikkun will come. But in the meantime, plant the tree, build for tomorrow, feed your family, feed the world, protect what's right, root goodness in the world, because that task will never, ever, ever end.
Andrew Fair is wondering, in Parshat Nasa, which we just read this past Shabbat, the Parsha contains rules for the Nazir, and he's wondering if the vow of the Nazir is evidence of chutzpah.
That's a great question. Someone paid attention, Shabbos. You rabbis should be very proud of yourselves. This is Machaya. You got as far as the Nazir. Woo. Okay. A Nazir is a person who takes upon a religious vow of asceticism. Jews generally don't do ascetic things. I mean, like we have one day called Yom Kippur, but we spend the whole day talking about who's going to bring the white fish and who's going to bring the bagels and who's going to bring the lox, Like we fast and we don't deny ourselves typically. We're not typically an ascetic tradition. But the Nazir is a tradition that says that if a person wants to live a sort of higher life of spirituality, takes upon a vow of asceticism. And the interesting thing is that the rabbis of the tradition are ambivalent about this. Some of the rabbis say this is, after all, a higher vow of spirituality. A person who says, I won't touch the dead, cut my hair, drink wine, eat meat, engage in other kinds of behaviors as a vow in order to show my devotion to God. But then other rabbis notice something. They notice that when the Nazir finishes his term, he has to bring a sin offering. And so they ask, why a sin offering? Of all things, you would imagine it'd be a todah, thank God I did this, or some kind of celebratory offering. Why a sin offering? And then they have this wonderful line that says, because it's a sin to deny yourself the legitimate pleasures of the world. It's a sin to deny yourself the legitimate joys of life. I want you all to hear this, which means if there is a pint of Ben & Jerry's ice cream in your freezer and you haven't eaten it, God is watching tonight. It is a sin. It is a sin. The point is that the Nazir, there's an ambivalence about this in our tradition. First, there's an ambivalence about anybody who thinks he can be more kosher than everybody else. And second, there's an ambivalence about swearing off the legitimate joys of the body. And third of all, the whole thing about Nazir, if you look at what the restrictions are, cutting the hair is a symbol of denial of sexuality. Not touching the dead means a denial of the bodily existence of a human being, and not drinking wine. We don't do it that way. We have a different way. We take wine and food and bodily pleasure, sexuality, money, and we elevate them to the level of sanctity. So money becomes tzedakah, and wine is kiddush, and sexual pleasure, joy is shared with loving partners in a relationship called kiddushin, called marriage, called responsible loving, and all the things we do with the human body is to elevate it into a symbol of spirituality. So I wouldn't say that the Nazir is an example of chutzpah. The Nazir is a very questionable institution. And the rabbis themselves are terribly ambivalent about it, because the question is, how do you deal with the status of the body in a world of, in a life of the spiritual? And the rabbi's preference was to elevate the body, not to deny it. And that was last week's sermon.
Yasher koach, Mitzian. One last question from Mindy Schwartz-Brown. And I apologize, Mindy, if this was from a while ago, but she writes that, so being godly is being able to share power, to listen, to respond, and not to exult in power itself. And she's wondering how you think we can evolve to use our presence in this way.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it, and I would congratulate Mindy on that formulation, because that's actually more than I even said, the idea of sharing power and listening. And I would say, and you'll forgive me for speaking about the events right outside our windows today, listening is the order of the day. It's very easy to jump in and say, oh, I know what that's like, my ancestors, and launch into that speech. But I have found that the very first task when dealing with this kind of protest and the kind of injustice that it speaks about that's going on outside today, the Black Lives Matter, is simply to listen. Simply to listen. Because you see, there's a task ahead of us, and it's going to be a gargantuan task. Right now, the protest is an expression of rage. Protest is an expression of anger. Anger is a defense mechanism. When you've been hurt, when you've been violated, anger is a way of pushing back. And this anger is very holy right now. It's very important to be expressed. But there has to come a time when we move from anger to a different temperament. And that temperament is deliberative. That temperament is reflective. That temperament is thoughtful. And that's a very different way of doing things, because if we're going to solve the problems of systemic racism in American society, we have to sit down together and truly work together, of all races and all backgrounds, to work together to create a just society, to create a society that fulfills the words of our sacred documents. But that's not with arms shouting power to, that's not with shouting slogans, that's not with signs and marching. That's going to be sitting down and talking. How do you move from protest to deliberation? And the answer is through listening. When the person who is in pain and protesting and filled with rage feels that they have truly been listened to, the rage begins to dissipate, and the reflection and the deliberation and the creative construction of a better reality comes to be. And that's going to be the next point along this way. That's the next part of this great process. And I am praying that the leaders of these demonstrations, that the leaders of this moment in our history, that our national leaders of all stripes understand this and that have the power of, look, it's no accident that the prayer we stop for is not a prayer at all. It's a commandment. It's Shema Yisrael. Listen up, Jews. Learn to listen. Learn to listen. And I'll just drush it in a very small way. My favorite, my chavrusa, my Shabbos morning Torah partner is the Sfas Emes. And the Sfas Emes offers a beautiful drasha, which is a very popular Hasidic drasha. He says, you know, God didn't just talk once on Mount Sinai. God's been broadcasting truth into the world since the day the world was created. What happened at Mount Sinai was that Jewish people showed up, shut up, and listened. And that's what Shema Yisrael means. It means listen. Listen for the God who speaks through the other. Listen to the God who speaks through the person in pain. Listen for the God who speaks for the person who says, I want justice. Listen to the God who speaks to your neighbor. If we can hear the God's voice through all of those people, through all of those vessels, those personhoods, then we can build the society that God dreams for us.
Yasher Koach. Beautifully said, Rabbi Feinstein. Thank you for your inspiring Torah. May Torah lead to action. I now want to turn it over to my friend Aviva Orenstein as we read words of Kaddish to Rabbanan together, grateful for the Torah that you have inspired us with this evening.
יתגדל ויתקדש מרבה. ילמד דברי קורותיה וימליך מלכותיה בחייכון וביומכון, חיי דכל בית ישראל, בעגלה וזמן קריב ואמרו אמן.
יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולמי עולמיה.
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי דקודשא בריחו. לעילם יקום ברכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה דמרן בעלמה ואמרו אמן. על ישראל ועל רבנן ועל תלמידיהן ועל כל תלמידי תלמידיהן ועל כל מן דעסקין באורייתא די ועתרא הדן ודי בכל אתר ואתר. יהי להון ולכון שלמה רבה, חינה וחיסתא ורחמים, וחיין אריכין ומזונה רוויחה, ופורקנה מין קדם אבוהון דבי שמיא ואמרו אמן. יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיא וחיים טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל אמרו אמן. עושה שלום ברעב וברחמיו יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל אמרו אמן.
Amen. And now we turn it over to Rafi Orenstein.
Hi. My father, Rabbi Jehiel Orenstein of blessed memory, loved being a rabbi. He loved Judaism. He loved teaching, as we heard tonight. And he loved just being in the lives of other people. And he also didn't mind the perks of being a rabbi. We heard from my sister Debbie, he did have a little placard that said chaplain, which let him park in many different places. Also, it was okay for him to arrive late at times because he knew that people wouldn't start without him, especially if it was a wedding or a funeral. But I wanted to sing a song tonight. It's going to be in Yiddish and English, and it's about a rabbi, and his followers, the Hasidim. And yeah, a little bit of chutzpah too. As the Rebbe sings, as the rabbi sings, singing all the Hasidim. All the Hasidim are singing, la 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 la, la 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 la. All the Hasidim are singing, la 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 la, la 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 la. Singing all the Hasidim. As the Rebbe tanzt, as the rabbi dances, dancing all the Hasidim. All the Hasidim are dancing. Hey ho, hey ho ho, dancing all the Hasidim. Hey ho, hey ho, dancing all the Hasidim. As the Rebbe faints, as the rabbi cries, Ve'en al Hasidim, all the Hasidim are crying. Honey, oy beis mir, all the Hasidim are crying. Oy, oy, for was? All the Hasidim are crying. As the Rebbe reads, as the rabbi speaks, Schlafen alle Hasidim, all the Hasidim are sleeping. Rabotai, all the Hasidim are sleeping. Schlafen alle Hasidim. Present rabbis excluded.
Wonderful. Yasher koach, Rafi. We say Yasher koach to Rabbi Ed Feinstein. Thank you for inspiring us with your Torah. We are so grateful to Sylvia, to you, to Aviva, Rafi, and Debbie. Sylvia, I don't know if you want to say anything. I don't want to put you on the spots.
No, I just wanted to thank Rabbi Feinstein. Tell him how wonderful this was, what a great tribute it was to my husband. And the only thing I regret is that Jehiel wasn't here to hear it, because he would have loved it.
Yes.
And I want to also say that your response to Rabbi Marder was the absolute best example of chutzpah that I've heard in a long time. And although I may not be preparing a sermon, I am going to try to answer that question myself. Thank you so much, Rabbi.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us and honoring Rabbi Jehiel Orenstein's memory, something that I believe we try to do every day here at Bethel. I know that and I speak for Rabbi Marder as well, that every time we're in our building, which God willing, we will be able to return to soon. But every time we are with our community, we are walking in his footsteps and building a holier community, a more just world, and doing so with a little bit of chutzpah as well.